Good evening, my name is Gerard Mijon. I'm the CEO and founder of Natural Womanhood, and I'm delighted to be here tonight with Deacon David Delaney to have a very important conversation about the theology of the church concerning natural family planning. I want to say a few words about Deacon Delaney. He is deacon of the Personal Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter. He's also the founder and senior fellow of the Mother of the Americas Institute. Deacon Delaney has his doctorate in systematic theology from the Catholic University of America in Washington, and his research interests are, among others, in the areas of Trinity, Christology, ecclesiology, liturgy and the sacrament, and the new evangelization. He's been teaching seminarians and deacon candidates and young couples as well for over 20 years. So Deacon Delaney, welcome. It's great to be with you tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited about having this really good conversation about this very hot topic, very difficult topic for certain people. And especially when you think that how the Catholic Church has been accused of so many things when we think about sexuality.
Yes.
And there are so many misunderstandings from thinking that the Catholic Church is completely out of sync with the culture, out of sync with science. The Catholic Church is very paternalistic, and on, all these accusations. And I think it's important tonight to really, or the goal tonight is to bring about what is really the theology, the understanding, the message of the Catholic Church in this such critical area that is so important for families. So my first question is going to be really direct on this, in the heart of this topic, and I would like to know, what is the Catholic Church's vision for sexuality?
Yeah, it's a very beautiful vision. It's one that, very sad, many, not just non-Catholics, but Catholics themselves, really don't understand as much as we really should. Yeah. The beauty of it comes from the fact that, as the Church teaches, St. John Paul II makes very clear, something that I think is, people would laugh at, I suppose, but the recognition that the Church is the expert on the human person. The Catholic Church is the expert on the human person because Jesus revealed to us what it means to be human. Our vision of sexuality, John Paul II, especially in his work, it was called a book that he wrote in Polish, Man and Woman, He Created Them, which is colloquially known as his Theology of the Body. But he goes back really to Adam and Eve, and he shows that at the very beginning, God creates man and woman first and foremost for one another. He helps to show that masculinity and femininity belong not so much to what we are, but to who we are, I would say. Okay. The distinction is this, is that Adam is first created, but he's created, and there's a problem, he's alone. And John Paul II shows how he almost goes back, the wording in the book of Genesis goes back almost to the beginning again, almost with a new creation, in which now comes forth the man and the woman. And the way that this is articulated is that they are really grammatically one for the other. Okay. They are known. Masculinity is only known in the face of femininity, and femininity is only known in the face of masculinity. And this, John Paul shows, actually goes back to the Trinity, because then he goes and shows that when God creates man, in the image of God, he creates him. This is in the Genesis chapter 1 as well. Then he shows that male and female, he created them. Okay. And the very next verse indicates something very important. The very next verse is, therefore, go forth and multiply and subdue the earth. This capacity for the multiplication, procreation, is linked intimately to being created in the image of God. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas didn't put this together, but in one place he talks about the fact that angels are much more like God than human beings are, because they're purely spirit. But he says, interestingly enough, there is another way that humanity is much more like God than the angels. And he says, as God begets God, man begets man. And this draws us back to the Trinity. It draws us back to the Trinity as the origin of masculinity and femininity.
So, to simplify a little bit, because of that complementarity
Yes.
and that capacity to create,
Yes.
there is this image, or this reflection. We reflect the Holy Trinity in that sense as persons in complementary person who has this capacity. Is that?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
It's exactly right, and it goes very deep. We can this thing that you could write. In fact, St. John Paul II writes a book on it.
Yeah.
But it's very profound, and there's a lot of depth to it that really takes some work to get your hands around. But this is the thing, that we cannot separate our procreative capacity from what it means to be male and female. Neither can we reduce masculinity and femininity to our procreative capacity. But this is important. They can't be separated. What it means to be male and what it means to be female is intimately, integrally located within our procreative capacity. But because it's ordered in the archetype, if you will, the plan of the Trinity, what it means is love. St. Thomas Aquinas says in another place, he says, the animals actually can procreate,
Right.
but they cannot love. The angels can love, but that love cannot bear forth in a new angel. They can't procreate. Only man who seamlessly unites the material order and the spiritual order can our love bear fruit in a third. And this does reflect the interior life of the Trinity. It's not an image of the Trinity. St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine say that it can't.
Because there is no male-female in the Trinity.
There's
right?
There's a lot more that could go into that, but it is a reflection of the Trinitarian archetype.
In the sense that it has this capacity to create. Now, you said something also about the person versus the who versus the what. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. This is a very important distinction to make, and I would say if Dr. Seuss was to write a book on the Trinity, this is where the distinctions get made, right? Yeah. He would call it three who's and a what.
Okay.
Right? One divine nature. When we use the term God, we're talking about what he is. And this tells us he's infinite, right? He's omniscient. He's unchanging. These are the things that belong to him as nature.
His attributes.
Exactly. This is what natures are. They define what a thing is. Who-ness is another way of being that doesn't divide up the whatness. Who-ness is much more about pouring oneself out. Who-ness is understood in the Trinity in terms of the Father is his relationship to the Son. It is this pouring out of the Father to the Son. The Son receives himself eternally. Right. This isn't change. Everything in God doesn't change. It's eternal, but we don't have infinite language. We don't have eternal language. So we have to describe it in time-conditioned terms, but then we remove all of the things that suggest that this is a change. But it's important to realize that who-ness is almost like, when I was growing up, I remember this magic trick. It was like a glass. It was empty. And if you emptied the glass, it started to fill up. And this is really what it means to be a person. A person is one who really becomes more who we are the more we give ourselves away. This is a very fundamental element of St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body. We are who we are. And who we are is conditioned by either masculinity or femininity.
In the sense that the person who we are is explained or realized through relationship.
Yes.
That right? So who is God as a person is explained in relationship to the other members of the Trinity. Who is a man as a man is explained in relationship to his relationship to a woman, not necessarily sexual, but there's a sense of that. That's where sex kind of comes in, really, because that's the biology of the relationship, I guess.
Right, but biology isn't separate from us. In our way of thinking, too much in the West, we try to separate things out, and we think about things in pieces and parts.
Right.
What we really have to look at in terms of what it means to be human is, first, men and women are the same in what we are.
Right.
We are men and women are not half human. We're both fully human what we are. So human nature, sex doesn't belong to what we are as much as it belongs to who we are. When a male person possesses his nature, everything then manifests what masculinity means. And masculinity, basically, and femininity, they come from the Trinity. They are understood in who they are. We define them only in terms of the created order and the visible order of creation. But masculinity, in terms of humanity, what it means is first to give love. And femininity means first to actively receive love. Then secondarily, after the woman has said yes, she then, as she incorporates that love into her, she then initiates love. And secondarily, the man then receives love. This is the structure of the person. And when a person who first gives love and then receives love possesses this body, you can see in the body from gross anatomy all the way down to the level of the gamete, right? The sperm. This going out into the world. And the femininity from, again, gross anatomy all the way down to the level of her egg, receives in and nurtures and brings forth from that another.
So that's when how John Paul II talks about the meaning of the body, right?
Yes.
And the meaning of the act is a meaning that's transcendent, but also a meaning in terms of, as you say, who we are. It means I'm a man.
Yes.
And it means a woman, because it means I'm a woman because I'm able to receive, and the fruit of this relationship is another child, possibly. Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
But our masculinity affects us. It affects all of us, body and soul, male or female. And the way we look at ourselves, it seems like we might be from Mars and Venus, but we're not.
Right.
We both are from Earth. We both have the same exact nature. We just possess it differently. Men and women have everything that the other has, but they just have it complementarily differently. And it manifests itself differently. So we can't separate anything. To try to separate out the biological manifestations from what it means to be a male or a female is to annihilate, if you will, or distort at least the person.
Yeah. So what's important here is that there is an order.
Yes.
So that the concept of the Catholic Church is that there is an order in all this. It's not just haphazard and do whatever is imaginable. There's an order, and also it's a center of spirituality. It's not something like we want to hide or we want to reject. Yes. But sexuality becomes central part of a couple's spirituality. It
has to be. It has to be because we're spiritual beings.
Right.
And the center of it is really love.
Yeah.
Love is the center. And what it means is that if we don't understand what it means to be a male or female, St. John Paul II makes this point very clear. If we don't understand what it means to be a male or female and live in that order, it's a well-founded fear that we will not fulfill who it is that we are.
Right.
We cannot change what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine. So we have to know what that means for us. And at its very root, because it's the order of love, it means that we will not be able to love fully, authentically, if we don't love in order with what it means to be male and what it means to be female. So it is so important, and especially for our day and age, when we are becoming so confused by that.
Yes, absolutely. Now, let's move to the next area. So having established this, one of the gifts of the Catholic Church is our sacraments. And the sacrament of marriage, I think, in the way the Catholic Church envisions and explains it and lives it, is quite unique. Can you help us understand a little bit now the relationship between sex and that sacrament?
Yeah. It's a very profound relationship. It's very important to recognize that if you look at Scripture, it begins and ends with marriage. It begins with the marriage of Adam and Eve, and it ends with the marriage of the bridegroom to the bride in the book of Revelation. And this is not accidental. In one sense, we probably don't have the time to go into this, but in one sense we can say that the first fall was with the angels. And they really introduced a disorder into the created order. And remember I said that what it means to be a human being is both material and spiritual. We are both at the same time, so much so that when we see the body, we see the soul. When we touch the body, we touch the soul. We are we're one unified nature that is made of one principle of spirit and the other a spiritual soul, and the other principle of matter. Those are so seamlessly united that, right, that to see us, we see what a soul looks like. It's the soul makes the body sacred. When Adam and Eve are created, they're created much later. This is one of the things that the church teaches dogmatically, that God creates the heavens and the earth at once, right? The spiritual order, the angels, and the material order. And later, man. Some of the early church considered this, right, man being created, as creation's failed redeemer. You see, we were created in communion with God, with this initial, right, original grace. And Adam and Eve were to bring, if you will, the Holy Spirit back into the created order, grace back into which was disgraced from the fall of the angels. And they failed. But notice he brings in not just man, Adam, but he brings in marriage. And marriage reflects Trinitarian love. It reflects the coming forth of the Holy Spirit from this knowing between the Father and the Son. This brings grace back into the world. But not just man, but marriage. Human marriage was to save the world, and it failed. As we get closer and closer to the advent of the incarnation, of all of the different ways that God relates to humanity, we see one become predominant. That as bridegroom, God is bridegroom, Yahweh is bridegroom to Israel as bride. What we see with Jesus Christ, right, that he shows us that what this relationship was in the Old Testament was a betrothal marriage. It was a marriage that was like an engagement. It wasn't yet consummated. St. Augustine shows us where this consummation occurs. It occurs on the cross, and he sees the second Adam, right, Jesus Christ, drawing from St. Paul, who was put into this deep sleep of death. Like the first Adam, who was put into this deep sleep, and his bride was brought forth from his side. St. Augustine shows, and he says, you see that the second Adam is put into this deep sleep of death, and this consummates the betrothal marriage. And coming forth from his side is the blood and the water, the symbols of the church, baptism, bringing us into the church, the Eucharist, which fulfills us within the church. This is the consummation. Marriage, again, saves the world. Jesus Christ's marriage to his church saves not just individual persons, but the entire cosmos. And St. Paul, again, talks about this in Ephesians chapter 5, what is called the great mystery. In the great mystery, Paul says, this relationship to Christ, to the church, is that relationship of husband to wife. That is a theological analogy. The husband, and just like Christ saves the church, the husband and wife save one another. Just like Christ saves the cosmos, all of creation, the new creation. We also, man and woman, and a marriage, just like persons are made to pour themselves out, marriages are made to pour themselves out. Marriage is also, human marriage, Christian marriage, is made to save the world. And so this is the great dignity of it. It is raised to the level of the sacrament. When the spouses love one another, they're not loving one another simply with their own love. Their love is united to Jesus Christ's love. They're loving one another infinitely. They're loving one another to death and back to life again. They're loving one another to heaven. And that love can be poured out and must be poured out to their children and to the world. And to be able to transform the world, to push back, if you will, the disorder that comes into the world because of sin, because of our sinfulness and our cooperation, if you will, with the temptations of the evil one.
So I follow you as the redemptive act of Christ dying and then consuming the marriage, right. And then this mutual gift from between Christ and the church, and that eternal union.
Yes.
Right. Then you bring this to the couple getting married, and so there is that union that
yes.
is on earth, and that's also that is confirmed with the act of sexuality, right?
Yes.
How is that? Because how is that eternal? How is that, and how is that also redemptive?
Okay, that's a very important point.
Yeah.
I think that we can go back to, if you will, how anything that a human being, a Christian can do is being redemptive. Paul, again, has this very strange phrase in his letter to the Colossians in chapter 1, verse 24. He says, first of all, I think he sounds almost like a masochist. He says, I rejoice in my sufferings. But then I've never really rejoiced in my sufferings, I have to admit. And this isn't the only place he says it. He says it quite regularly.
Right.
But then he goes on to say something that really seems blasphemous. He says, because they complete... I rejoice in them for your sake, because they complete the sufferings of Christ that were lacking on the cross.
Right.
Why? What was lacking? Mm-hmm. Well, St. Augustine shows that this is not reference just to Jesus. Jesus Christ himself suffered on the cross. Mm-hmm. What Paul's talking about is what Augustine calls the whole Christ, the Christus totus. Mm-hmm. Right? This is the fact that the head suffered all that he needed to. But the body's sufferings throughout time, the members of the body, Christians throughout all the places and time, still have to suffer. Those were the sufferings that were lacking. Their sufferings are for the sake of the building up of the church, for mediating what happened 2,000 years ago into the place and time that we are.
Yeah.
We do that because of baptism. Baptism configures us to Christ. Marriage is a sacrament of service. If we're baptized and we then become married, we are in what is called, right, the common priesthood, the priesthood of the faithful, right, the baptismal priesthood.
Yep.
We have the ability to mediate Christ to one another through our intentions as a baptized person. In marriage, it's a sacrament of service, like holy orders. It is the parallel of holy orders.
Yeah, because it's a vocation as well, right?
It's a vocation, and it's actually it's really an order in the church. The Catechism calls it, right? Holy orders, the priests, bishops, they're configured to Christ in such a way that they actually mediate Christ in their words.
Right.
In the sacrament of matrimony, it belongs not to the holy orders; it belongs to the baptismal priesthood. But what happens on the altar, the two are united together in Christ, so much so that they are configured in this marriage such that when they love, when acts of love, works of love towards one another,
including sex,
including and especially the marital sex, ordered to what marital sex is.
Yep.
This is really the one flesh union that reflects the one flesh union of the Eucharist. Yep. It's the same order of it. It reflects the one. So the spouses sacramentally mediate grace to one another. That's the fruit. They do it through their acts of love. So when they love one another, they're loving one another with Christ. This is what a sacrament ultimately is, an encounter with Jesus Christ. So when I encounter my wife in love, in all aspects of life, including the marital act, I'm encountering her, not just her, but Jesus Christ as well. And she mediates him to me, the only one that really can fulfill me. And I mediate him to her.
Yes.
And he is the only one that really can fulfill her. This is the way it becomes redemptive.
Yeah.
Because we're ordered by baptism and then by marriage to one another, we mediate Jesus Christ sacramentally. So if we were to be on, I don't know if many of us remember the USS Minnow, right, going off on a 3-hour tour and getting, if you don't, they get lost, they get on a deserted island. They're without a priest there, right? If my wife and I, or your wife and you, were to be lost right on a deserted island, you would not be deprived of sacramental grace. Your works of love for one another, your acts of love for one another, mediate Jesus Christ to one another. It's a very
Is it
profound...
also beyond ourselves too, or like graces and blessings beyond?
It flows from us, but then it doesn't. It's not sacramentally given. It is intention. It is our intentions.
Okay.
But it's sacramental between one another.
Okay.
If that makes a distinction.
Kind of a prayer.
Yeah, I mean, if we're baptized and we're in a state of grace, we are always mediating through our intentions grace to all of those that into the world. And so our love does that as well. But it does it more profoundly in this unique way of marriage and marital love. So our love for one another actually shares and radiates out, if you will, the grace of the cross to the world.
That's amazing.
Yes. It really helps us to see how all of this fits together and how profound it really is.
Yeah. So let's move on to maybe a little more of the practical field, but also the question of moral and virtue.
Yeah.
And the next question is, one of the unique feature, or we hear, I would say, in terms of catechism about chastity as a virtue, and maybe people think about, chastity is for before marriage, and then marriage happened, and that goes out the window. So could you explain to us a little bit chastity in marriage? What does that mean?
Chastity. Yeah, chastity it's true in some ways that chastity is a no. It's a saying no. But one of the things we have to realize is that because anytime we say no, then we don't like it. We get so focused just on the no, we ignore everything else. Yeah. But every time we make a decision, we're saying no to all of the other possibilities and yes to this one thing. So we need to focus on what the yes of chastity is. Chastity is a no to the misuse of the procreative goods, right? The misuse of procreative goods are the equivalent with saying they're not love. They're the opposite of love. If it's not ordered to procreation, then it's not love. Whatever else we want to call it, it's not love. It's the opposite of love. It ultimately becomes the use of one another. So we have to recognize that we can't separate the meaning of procreation from marital love. They both are together at the same time. And in fact, we can actually see how that's the case. We can see it's the case that because we're one thing, both spirit and matter, the spirit is actually ordered towards this love, pouring ourselves out to one another. That's the fruit of this encounter with persons, of the husband and wife. The bodily aspect of human nature is actually procreation. Procreation happens in the bodily, the biological order.
Right.
Those two, body and soul, were never meant to be separated from one another. God did not intend man to die. These aren't two separate things. Death of the body is a concession on God's part. It's not supposed to happen. If we try to separate the meaning of the body from the soul in the marital act, which is the soul, the unitive meaning, the body, the procreative meaning. If we separate those two, it no longer is the marital act. It's the death of the marital act. It's like trying to separate the body from the soul, and it becomes use. Chastity is the protection. It tells us to protect ourselves from using one another because that's opposed to love. The fruit of it may be greater pleasure, but it will be less joy. Joy, by the way, is the fruit of love. Love can only be had to the degree that we give ourselves away, that we intend and act objectively for the good of the other. So chastity is about the protection of the other, the protection of their dignity. And so it's saying no to any act that is closed to procreation.
So it's important. What I'm hearing that's very important to me is the fact that chastity is actually related to the idea of person and relationship. So this idea of chastity is actually the best way to give yourself.
Yes.
Right? Through the marital act, versus there is a way to be giving themselves to each other that is contrary to that, or actually breaks that sacredness in a way.
Exactly.
And break that idea of person. You're I'm no longer treating my spouse as a person. I'm using her
Yes.
And so then it's against love.
Exactly.
And so chastity basically is a protection, or it's maybe more, you said it in a positive way, more the orientation of
Sure.
of our spirit and of our bodies towards something that's good.
Exactly.
Versus closing that door and going to something that's
Exactly.
death.
Exactly. Any time that we are acting towards the other in terms of, even if the intention is to give the other pleasure,
Right.
if we do that in such a way that pleasure becomes an end, when it can't, if we make anything an end that's really if we make anything that's a fruit an end, really what we do is we turn what is a real end into a means to that end. Pleasure is a good thing. Joy is a good thing, but those can't be our purpose. Our purpose has to be the good of the other, because the other is an end in themselves. And we can accept pleasure, and we will get joy if our intention is the good of the other, rather than the mutual use. And this is one of the things I have to say very, very candidly. Even if the mutual use begins with a mutual agreement, it always ends badly. It always ends badly. Right. It turns into a competition. It helps to, and Satan knows this as well. It will turn our marriage into a competition. It will be, and it will at best become one of a managed debate, if you will, or
power struggle.
Exactly, rather than authentic, flourishing love.
Now you talk about a sexual act has to be open to procreation.
Yes.
And then that's the true meaning. But at the same time, not every act, and that does that mean that a Catholic family should be ready to have as many children as So that comes to the question of contraception, right?
Yes.
And so what is wrong with contraception?
Yeah, contraception is very difficult in our time, because we've kind of seen it more as something that belongs to medicine, and we use these terms that anything that can be done in medicine seems to be, if it seems to be okay, we should be able to do it. If it can be done, it should be done. Yeah. Contraception, at its very root, goes back to what we were talking about before. It separates the procreative and the meaning and the unitive meaning purposely.
Right.
It can be we can try to, it usually is trying to squelch the procreative meaning in order to have the unitive meaning. But again, if we...
because it just turns off the fertility. I mean, it just basically shuts down fertility. So that dimension of a woman and a man in their relationship.
Exactly.
Right.
It's because it is holding back, actually. It's saying, I want something, but not all of you. I want part of you. And usually the part that we want is those things that fulfill our needs, whether it be pleasure or a sense of self-affirmation or a sense of bonding. And really all of those things are wrapped up into the same bundle. Some of us, men and women, are aware of different aspects of it more centrally than others. But ultimately, it becomes really about the use of the other for what we get out of it, rather than about the authentic good of the other.
Does that mean that people who are on contraception don't love each other?
It means that they're inhibited from loving one another in the most free and full way that they should.
Right.
It may not be it's not their intention not to.
Right.
But we do a lot of things that's not our intention, but we end up damaging ourselves by it, unintentionally. And we don't realize why. And this is the most insidious aspect of it. We're not aware of, on the level of the spirit, things don't happen as quickly as they do on the order of matter. If I try to violate the law of gravity, I get immediate feedback.
Yeah.
It's not violated.
Yeah.
If I violate the order of human nature, the feedback is I'm less aware of it.
Right.
And it builds up more and more over time as vice. And before I know it, things are happening to me in my relationships that I don't like, that I may not be fully aware of what's happening. but it's depriving me of the freedom to love. It's turning me in on myself, which is exactly the opposite of what it means to be a person. A person is one who's poured out.
Yeah.
Things that we do that are not ordered to the way God has created them is called sin for a reason. Sin is turning away from God and turning away from one another and turning in on ourselves. This is why we live in a society of people that are, it's so dark to us today, because we don't realize that we have turned in on ourselves, because we have been taught to use each other. And this is what happens.
Even use ourselves is pornography.
Exactly.
Now, so let's move to what is the option, right? So natural family planning, and how is natural family planning different, especially if someone, is trying to avoid pregnancy.
Right. So the place that it is clearly different is what we could call the object. The Catechism shows us that there are really two major elements that help us to understand the goodness or the evil of an act. It's called the object and the intention. The intention is interior.
Right.
The object is what we can see from the outside. The object of contraception is actually taking some chemical or using to prevent conception from occurring. What is the object of natural family planning? There is no object. There's no act at all.
It's a natural act. It's completely...
Right. Well, it's the suspension of an act during a time in which fertility could occur. So there's really no act. The only thing there really is the intention.
Yes.
So the intention, there's not, objective evils only belong to object, not to intention. So the intention, it's possible that somebody using natural family planning might have what we could call a contraceptive mentality. But if they're using it, it can't be their full intention not to thwart God's will. To the way that it is, that's the intention of somebody who's contracepting.
Right.
So the intention may need to be purified, but it's very rarely going to be gravely evil.
Right.
It is simply, perhaps it's more selfish than it ought to be.
Right.
Perhaps there's more fear and less trust in God than there ought to be. Those can be purified, but it's not the same as saying, I will thwart the natural order of things. I will to thwart God's will. Right,
and I think maybe if you can relate the act of contraception to the sacrament, it's in opposition to the sacramental acts, right? If I understand right. I mean that basically you switch off the eternal, the supernatural dimension of the sexual act when you practice contraception, if I understand.
Well, because it does. What we're doing is we are sin comes into the world, or death comes into the world through sin.
Right.
We're putting to death the marital act. Remember, I said that we don't reduce the marital act to its procreative capacity, but neither can we separate it from it.
Right.
If we purposely separate it from, we do something to separate it, to squelch it, then we're putting to death the marital act, and it no longer is the marital act. It's an act of use. And so God comes into the human order of human life restored, and the Spirit comes into God's Holy Spirit comes into us through the matter and spirit, the body and soul together. If we're going to squelch, if we're going to pull those apart, we're kicking God out. God can't be in the midst of it. It is not. If we purposely contracept, it's not the marital act. It's a mutual use, and so it is not sacramental grace is not given, even if we aren't fully intentional about it, because the object completely destroys it.
It's an objective act.
Exactly. Both the object and intention have to be good for it to be a good act. And God cannot be present in grace in an evil act.
And at the same time, natural family planning can be effective into planning a family and avoiding pregnancy for a certain time. Of course, it also is beautiful because you can actually conceive using natural family planning and be more intentional and effective in conceiving as well, right?
Yes.
Now, if we think of the just reason for a couple to avoid pregnancy? I think that's a question that comes often is, when is it okay to wait, or when is it, wrong or selfish to not use NFP to avoid pregnancy?
And I think that those are the main points. It's important for us to discern, and there are a lot of things that are going to be circumstances that only the couple themselves can be aware of and judge. And this is one of the things that Humanae Vitae and St. John Paul II make it very clear with. The decision has to, that we, those outside, can help to advise and help to discern, but the judgment can only be made between the couple. So what one couple might discern are grave circumstances, might in another couple's circumstances that look very similar might not be the same. The Humanae Vitae, right, St. Paul VI's document that really talks about the grave evil of contraception and its inadmissibility, say that it can happen because of something that belongs to the physical order, but also psychological or spiritual, or the circumstances in which they find themselves, the couple. All of these things can weigh and should be weighed in discerning whether or not, we should postpone, delay, or space further apart having children, or even it says, deciding that we need to stop now. Some very obvious reasons, of course, would be the physical risk to the mother of having more children, would be a reason to of grave reason to delay. But in one circumstances, one of the spouses having to get through some very rigorous period of time, maybe something like in medical or after medical school, going through
so financial and personal,
another couple might decide that's not, but the other couple can justly decide no. We're not being motivated by fear, excessively by fear or selfishness. We think that it's prudent for us, and that for that couple can be a good decision.
And what's beautiful is that there's still this holiness in the sacrament, in the act, and this love that happens, and this sacredness of their relationship, and especially their marital act. Now, how then? Another side to look at. Sometimes we see couples who are really open to life. They want a large family, and is there a reason for these couples to also practice natural family planning?
Certainly, yes. I strongly recommend it. Actually, chastity can fall under justice, but it also can fall under temperance. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that we could actually start to fall into using one another in marriage if we don't practice things that help us in temperance, and especially temperance when it comes to the use of the sexual goods. If we simply can engage in marital intercourse whenever we want, then we can fall into the fact that we stop seeing one another as full human persons. Natural family planning, and this is something that's very important, the fertility awareness, and then the choosing not to engage in sexual intercourse when you can, is a very challenging thing to do. And we have to start changing the way we see and act towards one another. We have to start understanding one another more deeply and communicating with one another more deeply. We have to, sometimes it's been described to me as, you have, with a couple that is practicing natural family planning first starting out, is like a screen door hitting you in the nose when you realize that, we've decided to wait and to have children, and we want to, but we can't. It's a very irritating, almost maddening experience. We have to, that is almost, an Olympic training of love. To be able to say no, not for the sake of no, but yes, for the sake of the good of the other. We have determined that this is best for us in our relationship, and I love you, and I don't always have to express my love for you in terms of sexual intercourse. This helps them. It helps it to mature. Another thing is it helps the husband to understand his wife much more. If he is, my couples that I, help with marriage formation, I always encourage the man to be the one who does the charting.
Right.
He should know before she does where she is, and especially if during her periods that it's relatively difficult, he can learn to be much more attentive to her and much or less irritating or whatever it takes in the relationship to be more solicitous to her needs, but understanding her much more as a whole person, understanding that it's not her fertility, it's our fertility. And a second, if that's not a second, a feature of this is, and we both know a friend of ours, who discovered through this, that she actually had ovarian cancer, an ovarian cyst, that because in her charting it didn't make sense, and as she worked through it with those that could help to interpret the what she was seeing in her charts, that there was a serious problem. She happened to be overseas at the time, and she came back, and it saved her, at least her fertility, if not her life.
Absolutely.
So there are helping both to understand themselves much more deeply. It's not easy, but because it's not easy, it's much more beneficial.
And I've talked to many couples who practice natural family planning, and in my own marriage, and we see the fruit.
Yes.
That is something that is really unique to, couples who have practiced natural family planning for many years. There is this unique, very beautiful joy and connection between these couples. That is very beautiful. I think that, and we see that also it bears in, actually even statistically, where there are studies that shows the number of divorce, the communication skill, the mutual respect that exist in couples who have practiced and been practicing natural family planning for a long time. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, I want to bring that now to, okay, we've talked about Catholic theology, but is this natural family planning thing just a Catholic thing then?
No, it's a human thing.
Okay.
Right? The Church recognizes that some things can be known only through divine revelation, and that we have to accept the authority of the Church and of Scripture to be able to understand that it's true. There are other things that reason alone we can discuss, because God, when He creates after Himself. Everything has to somehow reflect Him. We can know about God and the way that we are from the way that the order of creation of things in the world. This is what the Church calls the natural law. We can know that biologically, what we are doing, in terms of contraception, is taking, if you will, a functioning system, a healthy system, and trying to break it.
Right.
How can that be called medicine?
Right.
Only when you're, living in a land of groupthink that teaches you that it's not. Anybody from the outside should be able to see that.
And it's only about 60 years old.
Exactly.
Right. It's like not very, it's a very recent idea.
The capacity to do it in the way that we're doing it,
Yeah.
No, so reason alone can see this. And what we've talked about in terms of how it benefits relationships, it will benefit all relationships because it requires us to start to be able to see one another as full persons and talk to one another as full persons. It belongs to the human order. Humanity should be able to see that the way that we are, is the way that we ought to be, We can see that there are certain things that ought not be. Cancer disrupts the human order, so we can see that doesn't belong to what human nature is. We can see things that, as human nature is, as we start to mess with it, we start to see unintended consequences.
Right.
And so reason alone can bring us to understand what it means to be a human person in terms of a procreative capacity, and that you cannot try to continually separate sex from children. To do so is destroying people, it's destroying marriages, and it's destroying our society.
And so, would it be a stretch to say that promoting natural family planning is a form of evangelization, even if it's not done in a purely theological or religious approach?
I can tell you that it can and it will be. I think that, I don't know if you have, collected, with your apostolate, if you've collected any data with this, but I can tell you that there are a number of touch points that help people to see, wow, why couldn't I see this before? And where they see it being provided from, where they see it being taught from, they start to pay attention more and more from it. We see this, in terms of classical education. Classical education is not is human, but is promoted by Catholics because we have the fullness of what it means to be human, especially. It draws people towards being Catholic. In fact, there was at the University of Kansas, in the 1970s, there was a liberal arts, classical education program they shut down because they couldn't figure out why, but too many people were becoming Catholic from it. So promoting things that are authentically human are, in a very real way, if they're not direct evangelization, they're what we would call pre-evangelization.
Right.
They're providing the foundation for helping people to see and to be open to the fullness of the truth.
So we've talked about a lot of great things. We've talked about sex and the Catholic Church. We talked about sex and the marriage sacrament. We went from there to the issue of contraception and how it's contrary to who we are and contrary to our person as person called to be in a relationship between a man and a woman, and expand it now to that becomes this beautiful gift to the world, right? This use, the proper use is the proper way to love. It's just like there's a proper way to respect somebody, and so this is it's agent in a way. Natural family, it becomes this agent in the world for a better marriage and better love. Closing word from all this.
Sure. Yeah, what I would say that natural family planning is a critically important part of really foundationally understanding what it means to be human. I think that it helps us to overcome in our society the confusing aspects of society, because what it does, I think, it puts really practically into action these theological truths, and it makes it much easier to help to explain what's happening, what the practical implications of the theological truths are. I think that it needs to be a central part of any kind of marriage formation program, and it needs to be first of all, I think the beauty and the difficulties of it need to be part of marriage formation in general, not even before. It has to prepare couples to be ready to go and to sign up for a technical program themselves. But if we don't do a better job, I think, of using, this thing that's very practical, and it can be presented as you are doing, in a variety of very compelling ways that can provide, I think, the foundation for what we can do with couples, especially Catholic couples that don't necessarily take their faith very seriously, and see this just as a Catholic thing. And I think that this can help to open their eyes. It really is, in a certain sense, maybe as we might call, as it usually is called, I suppose, low-hanging fruit. Those that you actually have contact with, that you can actually make use of, you can make use of bringing the fullness of the beauty of this to them through some of these practical elements.
Right. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Deacon Delaney. This was a very inspiring and very enriching conversation. There's a lot to think about here, but thank you. And again, where can people learn more about your organization?
Sure, it's mainstitute.org, Mother of the Americas Institute.org. Thank you for having me. I very much enjoyed it.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you, and thank you, everybody, and God bless you.